hold vertical handhelds in kind of a high regard because I grew up playing the Game Boy Color. This was my original handheld and the very first one that I tried. To this day, I still absolutely love playing on the Game Boy Color. And I've tried a lot of vertical handhelds over the years. I've tried large ones that still play original cartridges like the Analogue Pocket, which I absolutely love. This is an incredible handheld. On the other end of the spectrum, I've tried mini handhelds like the 35XX Plus that are smaller than the original Game Boy. This plays games through emulation, so they're completely at the opposite ends of the spectrum. So I want to know if there's something as comfortable as the Game Boy Color, but something a little bit more portable with emulation features like the 35XX Plus. After being stuck in Canada Post for about 4 weeks, my TrimUI Brick showed up. I played devices like the 35XX Plus and the Mio Mini for many years, but these just weren't very comfortable to me because they were really short on the bottom. Is the TrimUI Brick the perfect combination of portability, value, and power for a vertical handheld? Something that you can take with you every day in your pocket? Let's open this up and take a closer look. This unit was sent over for review from LitNXT. As with all my videos, the company is not seeing this video beforehand. All opinions are my own, and of course, I'm just going to give you guys my honest thoughts to what I think about these. So what exactly is the TrimUI Brick? Let's hop over to their website and take a closer look. It's worth noting as well that LitNXT has their New Year's sale on. If you use NY 2025, you can get 15% off your order. So taking a closer look at the TrimUI Brick on their website, it comes in a couple different colors. We have the black one here. This is the one that I have on hand. You can also get the white one with some gray buttons. This actually looks really clean. I kind of like this, and I don't usually like white handhelds. The purple one actually looks pretty decent too, but the one that I really like the most is this red. This just looks incredible. You can get this device with a couple different options on their website. Starting things off with the cheapest option, you can get this just with the console only with no SD card for $79.99. You can also buy this with the stock OS and a 64GB memory card with a couple games on it. This will come out to $89.99. This isn't a brand name SD card, and if you go with this option, I definitely recommend swapping this out. You can also buy it preloaded and already set up good to go with their Surwish OS. This is $109.99. The one that they sent over for me to review is their 64GB with the stock OS. One thing I like about their website too is their little bundle options. They have lots of cool different options available. This does come with a couple different shoulder buttons, but you can also get their transparent set. This comes with 3 different sets of buttons for an additional $10. If you buy them together, you also get an additional savings of 15%. So it's cheaper to get a bundle than it is to buy the console by itself. And this also should stack with the coupon, so you can knock an additional 15% off there. They also do a lot of cool things like laser engraving. That's pretty sweet. They sell things like a magnetic charge dock. You can get the protective case with it. These are always nice, but these are also 3D printed. Or you can get the original bag with the LitNXT logo on it. This comes out to basically the exact same price as the device does by itself. So if you are going to go this route, I would highly recommend getting the device and at least get the case with it. The case is essentially free, but it does save you about 97 cents. The tempered screen protector is about $9, but if you bundle that in, you also save a little bit, and that saves you $5. Not a bad price for what it is. This device features a 3.2-inch fully laminated screen. It's also worth noting this is an IPS panel. You can also customize the RGB directly in the OS. There's a couple different shoulder buttons you can swap over, and they're really easy to pull off. This only has wireless and Wi-Fi and eMMC storage with 1GB of LPDDR4X memory. The CPU is an all-winner A133P, which is a quad-core processor at 1.8 GHz with a 660 MHz GPU. This only has a 3000 mAh battery, but that's still pretty decent. This should get us about anywhere from 5 to 8 hours of battery life, depending on our settings. It also has a 3.5mm headphone jack and a microphone. All in all, pretty decent specs for what we're getting. Now that we've looked at what it is and how much it costs, let's open it up and see the device itself. let's open this up and see what comes inside the box. The box is pretty clean. We don't really see much about it except some of the specs on the back and some of the features. It also shows which color I have on the side. Mine came with a 64GB micro SD card, which I've already installed. We get a little instruction manual. We do have some English in here as well. Also have the device itself, of course. It's wrapped pretty nice. There's some foam over the top to protect it in shipping. Underneath that, we get a USB cable. This is only about a foot, maybe a foot and a half. It's USB-A to USB-C. And we, of course, get those other shoulder buttons. There's one set here. These ones look kind of rounded. The other set that it comes with is kind of raised up, and it almost has like a 3D printed texture to it. But that's all in the box, so let's set this aside. Let's take a peek at the device. Now, the first time I opened this to make sure that everything was okay, I was pretty surprised. This feels much higher quality than you would actually think. First impressions are pretty good. One thing I noticed is these buttons are a little smaller than I thought they'd be. The D-pad is pretty decent size though. Buttons feel really nice. Start buttons are a little clicky. The thing that stood out to me though, as soon as I opened this, is just, as mentioned, the build quality on this is just incredible. It actually reminds me a lot of my Analogue Pocket. The Analogue Pocket has this texture on the back as well. And just looking at the two of these, they look pretty similar, don't they? You do get those extra two buttons on the back, but aside from that, I personally really like the Analogue Pocket design, so seeing this on a mini handheld is pretty cool. Starting things off with the smallest vertical handheld that I personally own is the 35XX Plus. This one is slightly taller, but one thing I find interesting is the bottom on this feels much shorter because the screen is much bigger. The screen takes up over half the device, whereas on the Brick, it comes out to about half. The Brick has about 51.8 millimeters of height for your usable control interface, whereas the 35XX Plus comes out to about 52.4 millimeters. The 35XX Plus is 81.2 millimeters wide, whereas the Brick comes out to only 72.2. Another thing that I really like about this device in particular is this is much thinner than the 35XX Plus. Those triggers also make it much easier to stick in your pocket. Just take a closer look at these side by side, you're going to see exactly what I'm talking about. The triggers on the 35XX Plus are flared. This can catch on your pocket, whereas the Brick just has flat triggers. There's a little bit of flare at the end, but for the most part, these are pretty much straight in line with the device. So the Brick is just ever so slightly smaller than the 35XX Plus, but because this has flat triggers on the back, it feels even smaller. Compared to the 35XX Plus, I just find this one really uncomfortable to hold for long periods of time. Whereas the Brick, it's a lot lighter, but the quality feels better, and this is also much easier to hold. I could play this for a long time. Stepping things up to an even bigger handheld, the Gameboy Pocket is even longer. We have a little bit extra on the end, and it is slightly wider. It's just ever so slightly thinner than the Gameboy Pocket on the bottom part here. But up near the top, it is much thinner. You have their much bigger display on the TrimUI Brick, but the interesting thing is I think these D-pads are almost identical in size. The Game Boy Pocket D-pad is 18.4 millimeters, and the D-pad on the Brick is 18.4 millimeters. I kind of wonder if the original Game Boy Pocket D-pad would work in the Brick. The buttons on the Brick are even smaller than the Pocket though, at 6.9 millimeters versus 8.9 millimeters on the Pocket. Stepping things up to an even bigger handheld, the Game Boy Color is even longer at the bottom, ever so slightly wider again. One thing I notice immediately is the D-pad is much more firm on the Game Boy Color. This is a lot easier to push. Both are rubber membrane. The buttons and D-pad are bigger on the Game Boy Color, but all in all, the Brick is just a much smaller handheld. Again, just a really cool design. I still really like my Game Boy Color, but the Brick is really growing on me. And the last handheld that I want to compare this to is the Analogue Pocket. I think a lot of people are going to see this as an Analogue Pocket Mini, and I see why. Many of the features from this look exactly the same in their own way compared to the TrimUI Brick. You have 3 buttons on the bottom, which look almost identical. The D-pad kind of looks close too. If you look much closer, you're going to see that the edges of the D-pad on the Pocket are flared up. This one will bottom out though, which is not ideal, but still a really good D-pad. This looks so similar to the Brick though. The D-pad is slightly raised on this one too. Comparing these two, on the top, we have an RGB strip on the Brick, there's nothing on the Analogue Pocket. On the left side, we have the volume buttons on both and the power button for the Analogue Pocket. On the right side, the Analogue Pocket has one of its speakers, of course, and the micro SD card slot. On the brick, we have one of the function buttons and the power button, as well as some branding near the bottom by my finger. On the bottom, we have a USB-C port on both. There's the microphone hole on the brick. We have the two 3.5mm headphone jacks on both, a reset switch on the brick, and the micro SD card slot on the brick too. On the bottom of the Analogue Pocket is the link port cable. This does feel high quality as mentioned, but it's extremely light. So just how heavy is the TrimUI Brick? Let's compare it to these other devices. The TrimUI Brick comes out to 158 grams right on the dot. The 35XX Plus is much heavier at 188.8 grams. The Gameboy Pocket comes out to 170.6 grams. Despite feeling much lighter, the 40XXV is actually heavier at 215.1 grams. The stock Game Boy Color that I bought in Japan with batteries and a game comes out to 216.5 grams. This one has a burnt screen on it, so I'm definitely going to have to fix this one. My AMOLED Game Boy Color with batteries and a game in it comes out to 226.4 grams. Of course, the heaviest vertical handheld that I own is the Analogue Pocket. The Analogue Pocket comes out to 298.1 grams. As I mentioned, all the devices have a game in them and the batteries as well, if they're removable. So the closest thing that comes to the TrimUI Brick at 158 grams is probably my Game Boy Pocket. Just for curiosity's sake, let's remove the batteries and see how heavy this is. That's 149 grams. That's pretty dang close to the TrimUI Brick. It's about 9 grams away. The build quality on the brick is nothing short of excellent. A device this cheap that feels built as good as the Analogue Pocket really says something. Even the plastic kind of feels the same. It's like a soft texture plastic. This feels like a very solid built device, and so does the Analogue Pocket. Let me zoom in really close so you can see the texture on this. I really like it. The buttons kind of have a texture to them too, but you don't really feel it as you're playing them. The plastic quality continues around the back, and we have that same texture as I mentioned as the Analogue Pocket does. Both have their logo on the back. Kind of like how the brick has the logo on the bottom over the Analogue Pocket having it just on the top. One thing that I kind of worry about though is that the plastic is going to wear down like it did on my Analogue Pocket. Because this is colored though, it is hiding a lot of that wear. But if you look at it on the front, it doesn't look too bad, does it? It's worn down a little bit around the buttons. For the most part, it is quite presentable. So I kind of wonder how well this is going to wear over time, but the plastic does feel very high quality, so I'm not really worried. You also have your two speakers on the front on this one, whereas the Analogue Pocket, they're on the side. The back part up here is made out of aluminum. This adds to the overall quality feel of the device by giving it a little bit extra weight. However, this part up here does get a little warm. For what I play anyways, even the extra heat up here doesn't really bother me. Compared to the brick, the Ambernick just feels really plasticky. I gotta admit, so far I'm extremely impressed with the TrimUI Brick. So let's take a closer look at this D-pad. It has a nice pivot in the center. It's quiet, has a nice texture to it. It's not loud that it's going to bother somebody. I personally really like these quiet D-pads a lot better. I kind of like their logo in the center too. It adds like a nice touch to the device. I highly doubt you'll have any false diagonals with this too. An excellent D-pad overall. I don't even think I can compare this to any of the other handhelds that I own. The 35XX Plus D-pad is extremely mushy, and it can bottom out in the center. The Game Boy Color D-pad is also very similar, but it does have more of a pivot point. This also can bottom out though, and the Analogue Pocket does exactly the same thing. It bottoms out, doesn't really have much pivot in the center, but it does have those flared edges like on the TrimUI Brick. The 40XXV has a very similar D-pad as well. It bottoms out in the center. It's extremely mushy. Game Boy Pocket also does the same thing. It bottoms out and has an extremely mushy D-pad. If you look at the TrimUI Smart Pro, I personally notice no difference between this and the Brick. The D-pad feels exactly the same, although this one is much louder. There's a nice pivot in the center on this one as well. So what about these face buttons? They feel like dome switch face buttons. There's a nice click to them, but it's not too loud. I do need to show you this as well, but if you look very closely, there's enough space around these buttons that they're not going to wear on the shell. This is a big concern for a lot of people, but you're not going to have this issue here. The texture of the letters is imprinted into the buttons, which is a nice touch. All in all, the buttons feel extremely high quality. I can't really compare this to any of the other vertical handhelds that I have. They're all rubber membrane, and they all feel very mushy. The original Game Boy Color especially. These are also kind of loose. Not too bad, but you do notice it. The Analogue Pocket feels very similar to the original Game Boy Color, slightly loose and very mushy. The closest face buttons that I have compared to the Brick are on the TrimUI Smart Pro. These feel almost identical, but these have a more hollow click to them. The Brick just kind of feels like a much quieter version of the TrimUI Smart Pro. The Start, Select, and Menu buttons are extremely clicky. Not enough to bother me, and way quieter than the ones on the 35XX The trigger buttons are really quiet. This was something that I was worried about because I saw a few videos online that show these really loud. I don't think you're going to have issues with these buttons. There's a little bit of wobble to them, not enough to be concerned. There's a little bit more wobble on the triggers themselves, but the bumpers don't really wiggle much. To get these off, all you have to do is just pull them straight up. They're pretty easy to swap out, but I do like these stock ones the best. I also just noticed, but look, TrimUI Brick has the 4 screws on the back, just like the Analogue Pocket. These two devices feel so close. The volume switch also has dome switches to it. It's a little clicky, but I don't think that's going to bother anybody. It's not too bad. Next up, let's talk about the ergonomics on this thing. Well, it's pretty interesting because I find this more comfortable than the 35XX, as I mentioned. I'm not really sure why though. I think maybe because this is thinner. You can kind of spread your fingers across the back, or you can hold it like this. All in all, it's just a really comfortable device to use. You could also just use it with your hands like this. I think for me anyways, I'll probably end up using it somewhere around here. I just like the overall balance of ergonomics, size, and portability. It is small. It is a lot taller than the Mio Mini from what I remember, so I have a lot of space to spread my hands across. It's not bad. If you want a little extra, you can also slide your hands down a little bit more, and it does still make the D-pad very playable. All the buttons are also positioned really well. I'm not getting any cramping from moving my hands around. Triggers are comfortable to use, and the positioning is really good on them. So far, solid device, excellent ergonomics, great build quality. Next up, you want to make sure to insert the microSD card into the bottom. The label of the microSD card faces away from you, and that should click in nicely. This fits inside of the device, so the microSD card doesn't actually get in the way of your hand. The most exciting part of the review, obviously, is turning the device on and taking a look at it for the first time. One thing I don't like about the stock OS is just this clicky button sound when you're moving around. It should be fixable on a custom OS. On the main screen, we have a couple different collections that they've made for us. We can also press the menu button. This allows us to search for a specific game, or we can refresh the ROM list here. If you press the triggers, you can go between the different menus. So starting on the left and going to the right, we have the games menu, which shows us all the different systems and all the different games that it has. There's actually a ton of games on here already, even with the 64GB card. A lot of these seem to be alphabetized nicely too, and it doesn't appear to be any duplicates. At least in a lot of the systems that I looked. I wouldn't particularly buy this for N64 or Dreamcast, as I heard a lot of people were having issues with that. For me anyways, I want this for my true retro collection. I'm looking to play this with, of course, the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance, but I also want some Game Gear on here, Mega Drive, Famicom, and of course Super Famicom. If you press B, you can see what the menus are up at the top. Next up is the ports menu. We have 2048, Balatro, Celeste, Celeste Classic, Diablo Hellfire, Sonic Mania, and Stardew Valley. On the apps page, we can change things like our function key setting on the side. By default, this is going to set to enable or disable the D-pad, but you can also use this to disable or enable the clock switch. Appears to be a few different spelling mistakes in their stock OS. This is going to be fixable with a custom OS or maybe an update in the future. Since I'm not using my D-pad as a joystick, I'm just going to go ahead and disable this. Then I can back out. We also got things like being able to access the USB storage. We can format our microSD card from here. You got Moonlight, a media player if you want to watch movies. You can access the RetroArch settings here too. Not sure what this one is. This must be a control pad tester. This must be the panel tester maybe. There's also an ebook reader in case you're feeling brave. There's a net play menu on the next menu. and the settings options here. I have my brightness turned up to 11. I shut off my LED. The LEDs at max brightness do get pretty bright. For my uses though, I'm just going to shut all these LEDs off. You can also adjust things like your screen lock time from here. 5 minutes seems good enough for me. Someone like me that likes really high saturated screens, it's nice to see these options available. I've just gone ahead and kind of adjusted these a little bit, but I might play around more with them later. Color temperature, I like to leave around the middle so it doesn't look too blue or too yellow. Saturation, I bumped up a little bit, but I might bump this up to about 7. In the volume menu, you can also do things like enable the background music. I've disabled that, and I've turned off the rumble on mine, but the rumble is actually a lot better than you would think it is. I'm going to turn down the volume on the main menu here so I don't get any button noises. You can access your Wi-Fi, you can enable a hotspot or Bluetooth from here as well. Hotspot feature's pretty nice if you want to do trading with someone and you're away from the internet. There's a couple different themes you can enable. I'm just going to leave it on this default one here. You can change the key maps in here as well. And the system menu is on this last page. You can change things like your language, enable net play. There's a USB mode. If you connect it to a computer, you can refresh your ROMs, adjust the date, do a factory reset, test your hardware. There's a flash mode if you want to upgrade your firmware. The device info is going to show us stuff like your serial number and of course your firmware. And there's no pages further beyond the settings menu. All in all, it's a very functional OS and it's really decent in stock. Things I don't like about it, the only one I've found is unfortunately the button noise. If you enable the volume at all here, you will going to hear that and doesn't appear to be anywhere to disable it. Some of their collections are named pretty oddly as well. They're not really in alphabetical order and they have numbers before them. If you go to the full collection though, it appears that a lot of these are alphabetized, at least in the Game Boy. Let's see if we can add this to the favorites menu. If you press the menu button on the bottom, we can refresh the ROMs, open it, add as a favorite. That's what we want. Let's go ahead and add that. Now that should be under our favorites menu right there. I don't personally mind the stock OS. TrimUI is probably one of the only devices that I've seen usable at stock, aside from the Android devices that we're used to now. Pretty cool stock OS. I think I've had about half a week to about a week with this thing so far, and I gotta say, I think it's a lot better than I expected. I think next up we should talk about these speakers. They're pretty decent, but they're about what you expect for a budget device. Not bad, but it is nice having those two on the front. I'm going to compare it to a couple of these other vertical and budget devices that I have. So to me anyways, I think it kind of stacks up exactly where I thought it was gonna. This is about as good as you expect. It is better than the Mio A30. Audio wise, the Analogue Pocket absolutely destroys the speakers on the TrimUI Brick. That's to be expected though, because the Analogue Pocket is way more expensive. I was also going to check out the speakers on my 35XX Plus, but unfortunately I can't get this thing started. I've been having a lot of issues with this device here, so I definitely wouldn't recommend it. Another device that sounds better than the TrimUI Brick is another expensive one, but another pocketable device nonetheless. I wanted to look at this anyways because right now, this is still my go-to device for it being pocketable. If I'm looking for a horizontal format, the speakers on this sound much better, much cleaner, and way louder. I would put this somewhere between the TrimUI Brick and the Analogue Pocket. So these devices over here sound a little worse, these ones over here sound much better, but I think this one sits exactly where it needs to for the price. I don't think you're going to be disappointed with the speakers. So another interesting area where I think this device shines is the screen. It's really sharp, especially for the price. The colors are also well balanced, and it doesn't look too blue or too warm. If you look a little bit closer, you're definitely going to be able to see that. This looks really good with pixel games like Game Boy Color, and that's one of the big systems that I wanted to play personally on here. I still personally love the Mio A30, but the color just looks a little off on this, doesn't it? Between both of these, the Mio A30 panel is just much darker and the color balance is a little off. However, this is a glossy screen on the TrimUI Brick. This one is a matte screen. I think this looks really good for when you're trying to emulate that natural DMG style color. It almost makes the screen look like an e-ink display, but it's decent enough for most games and I don't think it's going to bother you. Still a really fantastic handheld, and I highly recommend checking out my review on it. This screen on here is just way brighter and it looks much better. This is the same game running on the Game Boy Color. Obviously, color aside, I am noticing that this screen is actually a lot brighter than the AMOLED on my Game Boy Color. Moving up from there, comparing it to something that's known to be very color accurate, the AMOLED on the RP Mini is way brighter. But you're also going to see that the color balance was a little off on this one. This is a little bit more blue, but you can fix that definitely in the color settings on the OS. The RP Mini, however, this is just how the display looks. And when I was in Japan, this was my go-to device for something that I would just pull out and play if I had a couple extra minutes. I think TrimUI did a fantastic job picking the display on this. I just thought it would be kind of interesting to compare these two, even though the prices are so far apart. To me anyways, these are both extremely pocketable devices, so I did want to kind of see the difference between these two. Now again, it's kind of hard to compare this to the Analogue Pocket because the screen on the Analogue Pocket is much brighter and more accurate. I've tried to load it up on the Game Boy Core, but it still comes out as color, so I can't really get a good accurate comparison between both of these. All I know is that this runs really well and looks great on both. I don't think you're going to be disappointed by the screen on either of these devices. Either way, fantastic screen, and I absolutely love the panel on the TrimUI Brick, which was something that I was not expecting. Next up, let's take a really close look at the screen to make sure there's no dead pixels or any uniformity issues. So I've got that filled up a little bit better. I'm still not seeing any dead pixels or any uniformity issues whatsoever. That's a really good panel so far. The colors also look really accurate. Usually on this nostalgic DMG color, you would notice a little bit of gray uniformity issues around the edges, but I just don't see anything. These little screens might be easier to get better batches out as well with less quality control issues, so that's really good to see. Motion clarity on the screen also looks really good. I'm not seeing any ghosting or anything like that, and the small bezel on this screen is actually a lot better than I thought. Now, because I have this on overscaling right now, it does look like it's going to go over the edge of the screen. So I can go ahead and go back to the advanced menu, go over to video, and I'll fix the scaling options. I'm just going to shut off all the scaling so it doesn't go over the edge of the screen. That means that the screen lens underneath the glass is perfectly aligned. I have seen this on a few different devices, namely from Anbernic, where this edge piece would just slightly go underneath one side, but it would come out a little further on the other. I'm also not seeing any flicker retention on this panel too. So all in all, excellent panel, and I don't think you're going to have any issues. When it comes to emulation performance, all the systems that I want to play personally on this, like Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance, they all look and run great on here. Game Boy and Game Boy Color are going to look a little bit better on this screen as the aspect ratio is kind of designed for those devices a little bit better. But even with something like Game Boy Advance, it does fill out the screen pretty good. You're left with a little bit of a black bezel on the top and the bottom, but it goes right to the edge of the display on the left and the right. You can also play around with the overscaling options just to see what that looks like. Right now, integer scaling is turned on, but if I turn off integer scaling, it does fill out that panel a lot better. This is probably how I would use it. However, you could turn on integer scaling with overscan and it might look a little bit better. Let's give that a try. So integer scaling with overscan will fill up the entire screen. That doesn't look too bad either, and I don't think it's cutting off a lot on the top and the bottom. Another thing that I'm noticing is just how vibrant this screen is. That is a really vibrant red. Switching things over to some Sega Genesis, I think it looks pretty good on here too. Fills out the entire panel right away, and I haven't changed anything. Another thing that I'm noticing is as soon as you press the button, you do get a reaction on the screen. This is pretty quick and there's barely any latency. This is actually probably a little bit better for showing the colors on this display compared to Cave Noir that I was just showing you. But if you look a little closer, you are just going to see how vibrant and crisp this display is. That's incredible for the price. I would say this is better than the displays we're seeing on a lot of mid-range Anbernic devices, and only their AMOLED and OLED displays can keep up with this. Obviously, stuff like the Analogue Pocket or the AMOLED Game Boy Color are going to look a lot more vibrant, but as far as budget devices go, you really can't go wrong with this display. You can access the hotkeys quite easy in these games as well by pressing this menu button down here on the left. This is going to open up your save states or load state menu. You can also play NetPlay from here, or you can open up the RetroArch Advanced menu through here as well. I personally wouldn't recommend buying this for Nintendo 64 or Dreamcast. It will work to some extent, but the device does get pretty warm, especially behind this back part here where that metal plate is. I have seen reports though that the new revisions of this will not be using this metal backplate. This really does add to the overall quality of the device and just how it feels in general. I don't know for sure if that's true or false, but I've only seen one report of that a lot of these newer ones might be coming with plastic backplates. Nintendo 64 does run decently on here though. The only real big caveat is of course your battery life might take a hit and the temperatures themselves on the back. Not bad, but I definitely wouldn't recommend playing this kind of system on here. It's pretty smooth though, as you can see. This is actually running way better than I thought it was gonna too. It does feel kind of weird moving around with a joystick input with a D-pad, but I've never really tried that before on any device. I just kind of wanted to see how well this worked. I did try starting up some original PlayStation title games too, but unfortunately none of the ones that are preloaded on here were actually working. They would try to start and then instantly crash, so I'm not sure if it's a PlayStation issue or just the way the emulation is set up default by TrimUI themselves. Basically all your older systems like Super Famicom, Genesis, NES, Game Boy Color, they should all work fine on here. I would just kind of sway away from using things like your 16:9 systems like PSP. Nintendo 64, as I mentioned earlier, is not ideal on this system, but you can play it on here. I also probably wouldn't recommend playing Nintendo DS. But yeah, all your traditional games and your older stuff just works well on here. Game Gear also works pretty good too, but that worked on the Mio A30, so I'm not really surprised there. Yeah, all in all, fantastic little handheld. I'm really impressed so far. Even after a little bit of Nintendo 64 and some light emulation like the systems that I just showed you, temperatures on this are much better than you would expect, hitting about 32 degrees just here where your hands sit. My studio is sitting at about 25. This is largely in part due to these hot studio lights, so about 5 to 6 degrees over ambient. On the back though, by that metal backplate, that is where it is getting a little warmer. This is up to about 36 to 37 degrees Celsius, or at about 97 to 98 degrees Fahrenheit. This is not uncomfortable to the touch yet. As I mentioned, don't play demanding systems like Nintendo 64 for too long because this will get a little hot to the touch. The plastic parts are not hot by any means, at about 33 degrees Celsius or 92 degrees Fahrenheit. My best case scenario for this, battery life wise, is probably close to about 8 hours. This is actually pretty decent because you are probably not going to be playing a little handheld like this for too long. Not that it's bad to hold on to, it's just this is kind of more of like a put in your pocket, play for a little bit, then put it back in your pocket kind of device. On the lower end, if you are pushing some Nintendo 64, you're probably looking at closer to 3 to 4 hours. But classic retro systems are going to get you some pretty decent battery life on here. And the battery's down to about 73%. I plugged this into a USB-C to USB-C cable with my charger tester tool. We're getting almost 5 volt charging, 1.3 amps at 6.1 to 6.2 watts. 6.2 watts to 6.3 watts is not quick charging by any means. This is pretty standard for most devices like this. All in all, this is not bad and kind of where I expected this device to be. Standby time on this device is also pretty decent. All you have to do is just tap the power button once and it'll go into sleep mode. I wouldn't leave this in sleep mode all day as you're going to experience a little bit of battery drain, but it's not as bad as you probably think, and you're definitely able to use that if you need it. This starts up and shuts down pretty quick anyways, so personally I would just turn this on as you're ready to play it. but if you're coming back in the next couple hours, you could probably just use your sleep mode and you'd be absolutely fine. This feels more to me like an Analogue Pocket clone than anything else that I own, and I can clearly say that this, to me anyways, feels exactly like how I would imagine an Analogue Pocket Mini to feel. So you want to pick up a TrimUI Brick? Do you need any other accessories with it? I think it comes with a lot of decent stuff already, but I would grab that case if you're interested in picking it up. However, if you want to take other devices with you, like the Analogue Pocket or maybe an x86 device, how could you take that all with you? Well, I probably would recommend a good bag. So this here is the travel bag that I take with me to work every single day. This can hold everything that I need to and with a little extra space. I've done a full review on this bag before, so if you're interested in seeing that, I'll have that linked in the description below. But let me just show you how this all fits in here. I do like to take an x86 device. This fortunately fits extremely well in this bag into the main compartment. The ROG Ally X has been my go-to handheld for taking with me to work every single day. That fits nicely in there. There's also a nice thin little pocket here at the front. I stick the AOHI charger in the front here because it's nice and thin. And this is a 65 watt GAN charger. This means it's very efficient, and it should be safe enough for all my electronic devices, including the TrimUI Brick. That fits in there nicely, and it doesn't really add much to the overall package width. So I got my ROG Ally X, my power bank, and I also have a little pocket here in the front. Now personally, I wouldn't put anything like a device in here because you have the zipper in here as well. I bring this 2-meter USB-C to USB-C cable with me. This is INIU, and it supports up to 100 watt quick charging. I also like to put a smaller cable in there as well, and some headphones. Now this front pocket up here is a good spot to fit any other little device that you want to take with you. The TrimUI Brick fits really nice in there. Seals up nice, and honestly, that doesn't really add any weight to the overall bag. The nice thing about this bag too is you still have a huge compartment here that you could put something else. If you wanted to put something like a battery bank for your x86 handheld, you can definitely do that here too. That fits in there. You even have a little bit more space in here too in that little pocket, and you could probably fit something else in the front pocket too if you wanted. If you're putting something else in the front pocket, just because the TrimUI Brick is up there, I'd probably put that in a little sleeve or something to protect it. But yeah, all in all, amazing little bag, and it's extremely comfortable on your shoulder. This is kind of what I like to take with me on a daily basis. It's nice to bring your handhelds and get some gaming done at lunch, on your break, if you're sitting down at a cafe or something. Either way, I can't recommend this bag enough. This thing has been incredible for the price. You can pick this up on Amazon, and I'll leave a link to that and the review for this in the description below as well. Because of the systems that this device can play, anything like a 512GB microSD card is going to be extreme overkill. And I personally think a 256 is also too big. I would go really no bigger than a 128. This thing already has thousands of games on it, and it only has a 64GB microSD card. If you're looking for a good value cards, check out these Patriot microSD cards. They're pretty cheap, and they've been in a lot of my devices. I actually picked up a 5-pack of these yesterday just for devices just like this. So what are my final thoughts on the TrimUI Brick? Guys, I honestly think if you're looking for a portable device to take with you in your pocket and you grew up liking the Game Boy Color, you're going to absolutely love this thing. This is easily one of the best mini handhelds that I've ever used, and I am absolutely blown away by the quality. The old budget king, I would say, was my Mio A30. They're both really small in your pocket. The Mio A30 kind of feels like a pack of gum just with how light it is and how thin it is. The TrimUI Brick feels more like a very small wallet. If you're looking to stick something in your pocket and get some gaming on the go, yeah, you can't go wrong with the TrimUI Brick. I like the Analogue Pocket so much. I did buy a spare Analogue Pocket, but I ended up selling it because it just felt a little excessive. To me anyways, now that I've tried this, I can easily say this feels like a really good backup to the Analogue Pocket. Quality's there, the screen is excellent, speakers are really decent, the controls are really nice, they're not too loud, and you can play this in public without really bothering anybody. The design is also very reminiscent of the Analogue Pocket, and if you were a fan of that, you are gonna love this. It's clean, it looks nice, and it reminds me a lot of the Game Boy Color too. The TrimUI Brick is easily my favorite device for go-to pocket gaming. This is definitely going to be coming with me if I want something just to stick in my pocket on the go. So what do you think about the TrimUI Brick? Do you think this is a good successor to the Mio Mini that's been in the community for a long time? Or do you want something a little bit bigger like the Analogue Pocket? If you have an Analogue Pocket already, do you think the TrimUI Brick is a nice companion piece for it? I'll leave an affiliate link below if you want to support the channel, and I'll drop a non-affiliate link there as well. If you have any questions about the TrimUI Brick, make sure to ask in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and as always, thanks for watching.